I'm now going to speak a little bit about the theological problem of the Shoah in Orthodox Christian tradition. I have 20 minutes. You are a mixed audience, some of whom will find what I'm about to say blindingly obvious, but there are others for whom this may be surprisingly new. I will try to navigate this by taking you on a theological journey, a journey made of observations and claims, which I will make quickly at a relatively high level and without a lot of detailed argument and evidence. I'll simply note that I believe I can back up these claims, and I'll be happy to take questions when we have our open discussion in the fourth session, or indeed at any time. Please just get in touch. Before proceeding, please indulge me in acknowledging the death last month at age 92 of a much beloved but underappreciated figure in the field of Orthodox Christian and Jewish dialogue. Father George Papadimitriou was professor of theology for more than half a century at Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology in Brookline, Massachusetts. He served as president of the Orthodox Theological Society in America and promoted understanding among Christians and Jews through various organizations, including the World Council of Churches and the National Conference of Christians and Jews. His ecumenical efforts included a fellowship in Jewish Christian relations in Jerusalem, which earned him recognition in the New York Times. It was Father George who first guided me into this field when I was doing my THM studies at Holy Cross in the late 1990s. I was overjoyed to meet him again at last year's OTSA conference, which honored him along with other long-standing faculty at Holy Cross. He followed up by phoning me after the conference. We had a long chat about our recently formed OTSA working group, Orthodox Christians in Dialogue with Jews, and he was delighted to know that the legacy of his work was being preserved and developed. Much of what I'm going to say here today is simply teasing out the implications of things he taught me. Memory eternal, Father George, and may his memory be a blessing. To speak about the theological problem of the Shoah in Orthodox Christian tradition, we need first to know what theological problem did the Shoah expose within Christianity. The Holocaust, of course, prompted profound theological reflection in many quarters, not least questions of theodicy. Where was God in all of this? Is God just? Is God merciful? But the question that dominated over all others was simply, how did we allow this to happen? And a consensus answer emerged that can be summed up in the phrase coined by the French historian Jules Isaac, who himself tragically was bereaved in the Holocaust. L'enseignement du mépris, the teaching of contempt towards Judaism and Jews that was embedded in Christian tradition. As we've already heard here, it may not be that Christian anti-Judaism led directly to the Nazi death camps, but an entrenched anti-Judaism meant that there was no resistance to modern racist anti-Semitism when it arose. Summing up Jules Isaac, Maurice Ryan wrote, "For Isaac, the Shoah would not have been possible without the consistent Christian teaching of contempt for the Jews played out over the preceding 2 millennia. This practice of contempt for Jews was enacted under the cover of the Christian message of love of God and neighbor. He believed the virulent anti-Semitism practiced by the Nazis could not have occurred without this conditioning of the population by the teaching of contempt. This was so even as the Nazis disavowed connection with the Church. He also wanted to demonstrate that Christianity was born from Judaism and could not have existed without it." This last point is important. For Christianity, the Shoah represented an acute theological crisis. It unveiled a troubling complicity rooted not merely in social prejudice, but in centuries-old theological disposition towards Judaism. Isaac's groundbreaking scholarship in works such as Jésus et Israël profoundly reshaped Western theological attitudes, and notably, as we've already heard, influencing the formation of the International Council of Christians and Jews at Seelisberg in 1947. The 10 points of Seelisberg seen here were formulated by Isaac, distilled from 18 recommendations he made for Christian education. And these points may appear rather modest in terms of our theology today. They simply urge Christians to recall basic truths drawn from the New Testament, namely that Jesus himself, along with the first disciples, apostles, and martyrs, were all Jews. They call for rejecting harmful and superstitious beliefs that the Jewish people are reprobate, cursed, or destined for suffering. Yet even these seemingly simple affirmations stood in opposition to what had become a dominant theological narrative. Isaac, of course, would go on to have an influential encounter with Pope John XXIII and an impact on the subsequent Second Vatican Council's declaration Nostra Aetate. This document decisively repudiated accusations of deicide against the Jewish people, rejected collective guilt, and marked a significant turn from supersessionism, the belief that the Christian Church had superseded the Jewish people in God's covenant. Now, these discussions were centered in Western Christianity, particularly within Roman Catholicism, and Orthodox Christians were largely outside this critical discourse. Of all the reasons given for this, none has to do with theological incompatibility. The points of Seelisberg are largely harmonious with Orthodox theology. They emphasize biblical continuity, affirm the Jewish heritage of Jesus and the apostles, and reject harmful stereotypes. But they do challenge Orthodox Christians to critically reflect on our own tradition and invite us into dialogue to ensure our teachings are grounded in respect and historical accuracy rather than perpetuating harmful narratives. And there are several intertwined historical, theological, and sociocultural factors that have contributed to this invitation and challenge going largely unheard. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Orthodox churches were historically constrained by communist oppression, limiting their engagement in ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. Moreover, the not negligible impact of the formation of the State of Israel and ensuing Arab-Israeli wars over many decades on the minority Christian population in the Middle East, the majority of which is Orthodox Christian, has not created favorable conditions for theological reflection and dialogue. Unlike Catholics and many Protestants, Orthodox ecclesiology is not structured for immediate communal responses to contemporary issues. Orthodox tradition is decentralized, with no single world authority. We struggle to come together to agree the sky is blue, let alone tackle difficult issues. Orthodox theology places tremendous emphasis on the value and authority of patristic writings, some of which include anti-Jewish polemics. We face difficulty addressing these texts critically without feeling that that would compromise tradition. And this has become all the more difficult under modernity when the living tradition of the pre-modern church, which always included a lively and flexible pastoral engagement with contemporary issues, was reduced by a more rationalist paradigm and black and white categorical thinking. Whilst Western Christians were prepared to jettison patristic tradition given its embedded teaching of contempt, Orthodox Christians don't really have such an easy option. Orthodox Christians have preferred a spiritual theological model for engagement and dialogue rather than the historical political model prevalent in Western dialogues initiated by Jules Isaac and others. In Isaac's own day, Orthodox theologians like Sergei Bulgakov and Leon Zander were putting forward the case for a more spiritual encounter and discussion. An understanding of the Orthodox Church as the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, again a claim hardened under modern rationalism, makes self-critique difficult, if not impossible. How can the true Church err? How can it need reform? Related to this is an unwillingness to learn from others. If we're not even able to talk among ourselves and have an internal dialogue addressing anti-Judaism in our preaching, teaching, and worship, we're hardly likely to engage with others in this work. There are notable exceptions. Orthodox theologians such as Nikolai Losky and Olivier Clément, who praised Vatican II's courage in addressing historical anti-Semitism. But most Orthodox are sadly unlikely to take any cues from documents like Nostra Aetate. An Orthodox Christian commitment to incarnating and living the gospel in particular nations and cultures, a good impulse in and of itself, has historically left it vulnerable to being co-opted by nationalist ideologies, often resulting in the reinforcement of anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, these are all true, but I believe there may be a deeper reason for this limited Orthodox engagement in post-Holocaust theological reflection, for this almost lack of interest in addressing what Isaac had described as a teaching of contempt. What if the teaching of contempt was not actually the fundamental problem? What more fundamental theological problem did the Shoah expose? And I believe it's primarily a question or even a crisis of Christian identity. What is ultimately the meaning of God's covenant with Israel and the eschatological ingathering of the nations? Father Lev Gillet was a French Orthodox hieromonk who wrote several books on liturgy and prayer under the alias A Monk of the Eastern Church. His remarkable book, Communion in the Messiah, was written in 1941. This was more than 2 decades before the Second Vatican Council and the watershed document Nostra Aetate. His book was even before the full horror of the Shoah was known and before the establishment of the modern state of Israel. He wrote without the help of the Dead Sea Scrolls or contemporary scholarship on Second Temple Judaism, in which we have come to know just how thoroughly Jewish early Christianity was. And yet in his book, Father Lev was prophetically calling for almost everything that has emerged in Jewish-Christian relations since, including the need to understand and coordinate the relationship between Israel and the nations within God's saving covenant. Uniquely, almost to this day, for an Orthodox Christian, Father Lev understood and taught that Israel, that Judaism and Jews, have an ongoing existence and reality and purpose. Of course, Orthodox Christians have a theologically and liturgically rich understanding of Judaism, including counting the holy ones of Israel among the most important saints of the Church, whose own experience of the glory of God, of theosis, is the pattern for the later apostles, martyrs, and saints. Yet we have no real theology of Rabbinic Judaism, which exists only as a rhetorical other in the patristic and sometimes even liturgical texts. For Father Lev, however, Rabbinic Judaism, sprung from the same Second Temple Jewish matrix as Orthodox Christianity, belongs fully to God's covenant and is compatible with Orthodox Christianity. Almost 85 years after Father Lev's communion in the Messiah, the world of scholarship has caught up with him. Let me quickly sketch for you the realm of what is called the within Judaism perspective. If you're in religious studies, you've definitely heard of this. If you're in theology school or seminary, you might have come across it. If you're an ordinary believer in any church, let alone an Orthodox church, you aren't likely to know anything about it. It consists of a series of narrative accounts of early Jesus followers that are simultaneously self-evident and obvious, but also completely transformative of everything in Christian theology. Here are a few of the insights. Jesus is seen not as rejecting Judaism, but as offering an interpretation within it. His teachings align with other Jewish movements of the time in their concern for ethical Torah observance, purity, and eschatological expectation. His halakhic debates on Sabbath, divorce, purity laws are understood as intra-Jewish legal discussions, not anti-Jewish critiques. The Gospels reflect a Jewish worldview steeped in scriptural allusion, Jewish apocalypticism, and internal critique. And the strong polemic within the Gospels is not evidence of anti-Judaism, but a part of internal Jewish disputes, comparable to other sectarian conflicts within Second Temple Judaism. Jesus' own ministry was almost entirely directed toward fellow Jews, and his central proclamation of the kingdom of God can only be understood in light of Jewish apocalyptic and prophetic traditions. It aligns with the expectations of divine intervention, justice, and the vindication of Israel, not a spiritualized or ecclesiastical redefinition of those. His teachings resonate with Hillel, the Dead Sea Scrolls, apocalyptic groups, and prophetic traditions. Paul, the apostle, did not convert to a new religion. He continued to see himself as a faithful Jew, loyal to the God of Israel and Jewish people. His mission was not to replace Judaism, but to bring the nations into relationship with the God of Israel through Jesus the Messiah, without requiring conversion to Judaism. His letters address Gentile inclusion into God's covenant promises, not the exclusion of Jews. Paul believed the Messianic age had dawned with Jesus' resurrection. The nations joining with Israel was part of the expected eschatological ingathering of all the nations. His gospel was not law-free, but Jewish apocalyptic in tone, rooted in Israel's scriptures. He did not reject the Torah. He saw it as valid for Jews. His critique of the law was specific to Gentile adoption, not a universal rejection. Torah observance remains normative for Jews, including Jewish followers of Jesus. Paul expected Jew and Gentile unity in worship of Israel's God, not erasure of difference. And the partings of the ways between what will finally be called Judaism and Christianity is now seen to be a many centuries long and never truly definitive process. In sum, the within Judaism scholarship on the question of Israel and the nations among early Jesus followers emphasizes that the early Jesus movement was fundamentally a Jewish phenomenon that did not originally intend to form a separate religious identity outside Judaism. The earliest followers of Christ, including Paul, envisaged a community of Jews and Gentiles reconciled in the Messiah, but not homogenized. Those from the nations who turned to the God of Israel through Christ did not become Jews. Rather, they joined Israel's covenantal story without replacing or negating the Jewish people. Jewish followers of Jesus maintained Jewish identity, Torah observance, and ethnic distinctiveness, envisaging a future in which Israel and the nations coexist as distinct yet interconnected groups, unified yet remaining within the overarching structure of Jewish covenantal theology. Now, we've acknowledged that Orthodox churches and Orthodox Christians have been historically slower to engage in Jewish-Christian dialogue than other traditions. Yet we are in many ways uniquely well-positioned to receive and respond fruitfully to the within Judaism perspective on early Christianity. Here are several theological, liturgical, and ecclesial reasons why. Orthodox Christianity has always insisted on continuity between the original and renewed covenants. The Church sees itself not as a replacement of Israel, but in total continuation with it, just eschatologically reframed in light of the Christ event. This theological instinct harmonizes well with the within Judaism perspective, which likewise rejects supersessionism and emphasizes continuity within the unfolding of God's covenantal purposes. The Orthodox Church preserves a richly developed liturgical tradition that is saturated with biblical language, particularly from the Psalms, prophets, and scriptural narratives. These are not treated as relics of the past. Orthodox worship already sees itself as being within the story of Israel, not outside or above it, resonating strongly with the within Judaism model. Unlike Western traditions shaped by Augustine's doctrine of original sin, the Orthodox Church has maintained a more positive view of human nature and divine law. This allows for a more sympathetic engagement with Jewish understandings of Torah as gift and covenant, not as burden or curse. The within Judaism perspective highlights that the Torah remains a valid covenant for Jews. Orthodoxy's more synergistic anthropology and non-legalistic view of salvation can more easily affirm this without contradiction. Orthodox ecclesiology emphasizes unity and diversity. Local churches remain distinct yet united. Liturgical practices differ yet belong to one tradition. The within Judaism model's insistence on enduring Jewish distinctiveness fits well within an Orthodox framework that values conciliarity and diversity without fragmentation. Orthodoxy is at home with mystery, paradox, and theological tensions held together in worship and sacrament. Paul's vision of the nations being grafted into Israel, yet Israel still possessing a distinct and irrevocable calling, can be affirmed within the Orthodox theological habit of embracing mystery rather than resolving it into a system. The Orthodox Church has no singular magisterial pronouncement equivalent to extra ecclesiam nulla salus, or the kind of supersessionist dogma that defined much of Western Christianity for centuries. Whilst anti-Jewish rhetoric exists in Orthodox history and liturgy and must be addressed, there's no doctrinal obstacle preventing a recovery of Paul as a Jewish thinker or of Israel's ongoing covenantal role. This offers theological flexibility to engage constructively with Jewish interlocutors and the findings of within Judaism scholarship. Orthodoxy emphasizes that the fullness of God's plan is yet to be revealed. The Church awaits the second coming with vigilance, humility, and a sense that God's ways remain hidden from us. Such a posture invites humility toward the Jewish people and openness to the mystery of God's unfolding plan. So while Orthodoxy has often been hesitant to engage directly in post-Holocaust theology or Jewish-Christian dialogue, its theological architecture is surprisingly well suited to the within Judaism recovery of early Christianity. Its strong sense of continuity with Israel, liturgical immersion in the scriptures of Israel, and its openness to mystery all provide fertile ground for deeper engagement. What is now needed is a conscious retrieval, a willingness to revisit Paul and the early church through this lens, not as an alien framework, but as a return to sources long embedded in Orthodox memory. Such a move could enrich Orthodox self-understanding and open profound avenues of reconciliation and dialogue with Judaism. Coming back then to this fundamental question, for which a teaching of contempt is only a symptom, the question of Christian identity amidst Israel and the nations. Let's wrap up by looking at this from the liturgical texts that are the distillation of patristic thought. I've selected a few hymns from just one of the days on the church calendar, the feast of the entrance of the Lord into Jerusalem, that is Palm Sunday or Willow Sunday, depending on your climatic zone. We'll go over these quickly, but I want you to notice, in terms of the embedded theology of Israel and the nations, and where Orthodox Christians are supposed to locate themselves within that, is that this witness is incoherent and inconsistent, just like the scriptures themselves. And as ever, the liturgy mirrors and rehearses the scriptures in all their ambiguity. So here are a few of those hymns. Here we have the statement that the Church of the Holy Ones offers praise to thee, O Christ, who dwellest in Zion, and Israel rejoices in thee that made him. The mountains, figuring the stony-hearted nations, exult before thy face, and they sing to thee, O Lord, a hymn of victory. This theme of Israel and the nations occurs again and again in our hymnography. And notice here how positively Israel is depicted and how negatively the nations are. The nations are stony-hearted. Israel and Zion are the church of the holy ones. The young foal upon which Christ sits is a symbol of Christ coming to destroy the senseless error of idolatry, to restrain the untamed willfulness of those nations. His riding on a foal prefigures how the nations, as yet untamed and uninstructed, were to pass from unbelief to faith. And yet here, sadly, we also have a statement that, according to the historical event, certain Jews, but here stated more widely, Jews blasphemed unlawfully. Notice how law is, though, depicted positively, because they are acting against the law. And here, in all this ambiguity in the hymnography, we have a statement that seems somewhat supersessionist. The new or renewed Israel is a church of the nations, and yet at the same time is crying with the prophet Zechariah and calling the daughter of Zion to rejoice and celebrating the coming of the King of Israel. And here together, the daughter of Zion is glad, and the nations of the earth rejoice exceedingly. Israel and the nations coming together. And finally, in a statement that we find throughout the Orthodox liturgy, peace be upon Israel and salvation to the nations. So as I say, like the scriptures themselves, which speak ambiguously about Israel and the nations, and that's a whole discussion which we don't have time for here, but I can back that up. What it calls out for is an interpretive theological framework to make sense of these passages. They do not speak unambiguously on their own. These hymns mirror the biblical ambiguity about Israel and the nations in at least three ways. Election of Israel is not abolished, but is somehow being reinterpreted. And that could be an extension, it could be a displacement. That's not clear. We have to interpret that. Judgment and mercy fall on both sides. The nations are idolaters, but are being saved. Israel blasphemes, but is still the holy city and still rejoices in God. And throughout, Zion remains central. Even as the Gentiles are gathered from afar, they come to Zion, not away from it. This retains the Jewish root of salvation history, even as its branches spread universally. And this liturgical ambiguity is crucial. The tradition has often leaned too far towards rejection, interpreting Jewish unbelief as divine punishment and Christian faith as triumph. But the very texts of our worship hold a deeper tension. They still name Zion as the dwelling of God. They still speak blessing upon Israel. These ambiguities give Orthodox theology resources, however underexplored, to move away from supersessionism and toward a vision of coexistent covenantal faithfulness. And as I say, the within Judaism perspective, arguably the best construal of the collection of first-century Jewish commentary or midrash on the scriptures that we call the New Testament, offers us a helpful and coherent hermeneutic to do this. So what would this look like? What are some of the theological and ecclesiological principles of Orthodox Christianity within Judaism? Israel would mean first and nearly exclusively the genealogical people of Israel, and it implies the importance and concrete realities of land and people. Zion and Jerusalem and so on cannot function typologically if they are not first and foremost concrete realities embedded in real time and space. National Orthodox churches represent the eschatological ingathering of the nations alongside, not replacing, alongside Israel to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Israel and the nations belong together to the renewed covenant, to the shared people of God, and are co-inheritors of the Messianic kingdom. Safeguarding the distinction between Israel and the nations is the foundation for peacefully preserving all distinct national identities within the communion of God's people. Unless we get this distinction right, then the distinction of any national identity is in jeopardy. Indeed, such a unified diversity and diversified unity is the basis of all other forms of inclusion, any proper form, as it were, of DEI, and as such is an eschatological sign to the heavenly powers, according to Ephesians 3:10. The pastoral and societal implications of Orthodox Christianity construed within Judaism: enduring respect and reverence, and indeed gratitude, not boasting, from those of the nations towards the people of Israel, no longer contempt. Acknowledgement of an already existing, mysterious, and hidden yet real communion, though not fully revealed. Commitment that the whole Orthodox tradition, from scriptures, New Testament, liturgy, church fathers, canons, iconography, and so forth, ought to be carefully interpreted and taught in light of the foundational and irrevocable covenant between God and Israel, whose purpose was to bless all nations. Recognition that proselytism is unnecessary and unhelpful, and all engagement in dialogue should aim at encouraging others to faithfully and wholeheartedly practice their own tradition. Realization that Orthodox Christian relations with Jews are an intra-faith, not interfaith endeavor, and Catholics are ahead of us in this. You note that the dicastery for ecumenism is what handles relations with Jews, not the one for interfaith dialogue. And finally, undertaking that those of Jewish background within Orthodox churches should be able to and should be supported in preserving and practicing their identity. Just very quickly in closing, we've just been celebrating Pascha, the time when in most Orthodox churches we bring out every possible language. What a glorious celebration of the ingathering of the nations alongside Israel that celebration is. And it struck me this year that the entrance hymn, entrance verse at the Divine Liturgy on Pascha, "Bless God in the churches, the Lord, O you who are of Israel's fountain," is such a wonderful way of summing up what I'm talking about here. The churches of the nations may not be Israel, they are alongside Israel, but we might say they are of Israel's fountain. And finally, we've had our post-Shoah theology all along. Every day at Vespers, we repeat the hymn of Saint Simeon, in which Christ is seen to be the one who enlightens the nations, but is also the glory of his people Israel. Thank you.